Hello and welcome to another Bible study in the life of David. We're actually halfway through the life of Absalom, his son, and we're going to see he commits a monumental blunder in chapters 17 and 18 of the second book of Samuel. What do we know of him so far? We know he was born when David was king in Hebron for 7.5 years, ruling just over one tribe, the tribe of Judah. We know that he was David's third son, but son number 1 and son number 2 have died, so Absalom is next in line to the throne. We know that his mother was not an Israelite. She came from the northeast of Galilee, from a place called Geshur. We also know he was very good looking. He's described in chapter 14 this way: in all Israel, there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his foot, there was no blemish in him. Whenever he cut the hair of his head, he used to cut his hair once a year because it became too heavy for him. He would weigh it, and its weight was 200 shekels by the royal standard. His hair was his pride and his joy. But we know from last time's talk that he is a traitor to David. So let's draw up a charge sheet. We remember he nursed his grudge against his brother Amnon, who had raped their sister. He nursed that grudge for 2 years. He then arranged to have Amnon murdered in cold blood at a meal. Revenge is a dish best served cold, they say. Like Prince Harry, having offended his father by killing one of his sons, Prince Absalom fled. He fled abroad. He fled to the land of his wife's parents, and he stayed there for 3 years. When he did come back to Jerusalem, he resented not being able to see the king. He was banished to Frogmore Cottage instead of being allowed to go to Buckingham Palace, and he spent 2 years festering this resentment. And then you may remember he forced a meeting with Joab by sending his men to set fire to Joab's barley field. What a thing to do. And Joab did then go to see Absalom, and in the long term it turned out to Absalom's advantage because Joab managed to persuade the king to allow Absalom an audience with the king. But once he became a celebrity, his status went to his head. You remember he bought a chariot and had 50 lifeguards appointed. And then he played politics, kissing babies and kissing ordinary people, sowing dissatisfaction with David as judge. And then he delayed fulfilling a vow to the Lord for 4 years, which he should have fulfilled long before. And then he recruited 200 men to strike a coup against King David. Treason. David had to flee from Jerusalem because Absalom was now there as king. During World War II, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother as we know her, was advised to emigrate to Canada and take with her the Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret to save their lives. And Queen Elizabeth said, "The girls will never leave without me. I will never leave without the king, and the king will never leave." They were inspiring words in those days. But here in this story, in the book of Samuel, David has had to flee. He's had to leave his throne. He's had to leave his money, his wealth. He's had to leave his power base. He's had to leave his friends and family. He's had to get out of Jerusalem to save lives. Absalom is now king in Jerusalem. But what is he going to do about David? So the next section is about good advice and bad advice for Absalom. It's chapter 17, but I'm going to start at the end of 16. Now, in those days, the advice Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. Ahithophel said to Absalom, "I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he's weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed." This plan seemed good to Absalom, and to all the elders of Israel. It was a good plan. Ahithophel said, strike while the iron's hot, strike while David and his men are confused, strike while they're weary and weak, but don't have a full-scale battle, army against army. Go for the king. Get him. If you cut off the head of the snake will die. And then he said, you'll save loads and loads of casualties. So many people will be unharmed. But do it, and do it now. Remember, he wanted to humiliate David because he was the grandfather of Bathsheba, who had been humiliated by the king. Now, remember David's prayer in chapter 15, verse 31. Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. And David had planted a spy in Absalom's court, Hushai. So in verses 4 to 14, Hushai gives a second opinion. He says, I wouldn't do that if I were you. That's not good advice. He said, don't believe that David is exhausted and worn out and wouldn't fight back. He'd be like a bear robbed of its cubs. He'd be like a wild animal. He'll be ferocious in the way he attacks you. And it won't be easy to find him. And your troops will become demoralized. Hushai is using Project Fear. And he then appeals to Absalom's vanity. He says, what you need is full mobilization. Do you remember Rishi Sunak said, we're going to mobilize all the 18-year-olds. Go for full-scale mobilization. Enlist everybody in the army and make yourself commander-in-chief. Well, that would appeal to Absalom's pride, wouldn't it? But in verse 14, Absalom opted to take Hushai's advice, not Ahithophel's. The spy was a faithful, and his inferior advice had worked. Because it says in verse 14, for the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. God's plan was to establish David's kingdom forever. God's plan was to ensure that Hushai's advice was taken and not that of Ahithophel. Well, let's read from verse 15 now then of chapter 17. Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, Ahithophel has advised Absalom and the elders of Israel to do such and such, but I have advised them to do so and so. Now, send a message at once and tell David, do not spend the night at the fort in the wilderness. Cross over without fail, or the king and all the people with him will be swallowed up. Jonathan and Ahimaaz were staying at En-Rogel. A female servant was to go and inform them, and they were to go and tell King David, for they could not risk being seen entering the city. But a young man saw them and told Absalom. So the two of them left at once and went to the house of a man in Bahurim. He had a well in his courtyard, and they climbed down into it. His wife took a covering and spread it out over the opening of the well and scattered corn over it. No one knew anything about it. When Absalom's men came to the woman at the house, they asked, where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan? The woman answered them, they crossed over the brook. The men searched, but found no one, so they returned to Jerusalem. After they had gone, the two climbed out of the well and went to inform King David. They said to him, set out and cross the river at once. Ahithophel has advised such and such against you. So David and all the people with him set out and crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, no one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order and then hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. Hushai brought Zadok and Abiathar together and told him what was going on. So those two men needed to get a message to David. He needed to advise David to get across the River Jordan for his own safety. So a servant girl was sent to find these two priests, the archbishop's sons. But they were spotted, and Absalom was informed and sent people to arrest these two men. But they went to a sympathizer, and this sympathizer allowed the two priests, the sons of Abiathar and Zadok, to go into a well, and the man's wife covered the well with a cloth and scattered it with grain. This would be at ground level. And so when the troops, the men of Absalom came to arrest the two priests, they were not to be found. And the man's wife said, oh, they went over there. That was a bit of a porky. It was a wild goose chase, and they never did find the two men. And so the two men got out of the well, and they went on the long journey from Jerusalem to Jericho and down to the Jordan. They got to David and they told him, and they said, you must cross the Jordan into relative safety. Ahithophel now knows his life is in danger. If and when David gets back to Jerusalem, Ahithophel is going to be executed. And what happened to him? He saddled his donkey, set out for his house, put his house in order, then hanged himself. Have you noticed, as we've been going through these books of Samuel, how often we see something happening in these books like what happens in the Gospels? Hannah in the Old Testament was like Mary in the New. They both sang songs of praise to God. David in the Old Testament, so much like Jesus in the New, the man appointed to be king. And Ahithophel in the Old Testament, rather like Judas in the New. Both men wanted to avoid God's king becoming king. And both men ended up in a sorry state. They went out and hanged themselves. In chapter 17, verses 24 to 29, meanwhile, Absalom has appointed a new commander-in-chief for his army, Amasa. And Amasa crosses the Jordan, but David has gone north to where sympathizers brought him support. I don't know if you remember, but when Saul died, Abner wanted Ishbosheth, son of Saul, to become king. And Ishbosheth was set up as king in Mahanaim. Now, Mahanaim is on the east side of the Jordan, and it's in the north to the east of the river of the Sea of Galilee. That's where David went now. And there he was supported by people who brought him stuff. Look at verse 29. Barzillai, as others, brought bedding and bowls and articles of pottery. They also brought wheat and barley, flour and roasted grain, beans and lentils, honey and curds, sheep and cheese from cow's milk for David and the people to eat. For they said, the people have become exhausted and hungry and thirsty in the wilderness. How extraordinary. The great King David is so impoverished that he's reliant upon the food bank provided by this man, Barzillai. He's reliant on charity to feed his army. He really is down on his uppers. The people felt sorry for David and his men. The people have become exhausted and hungry and thirsty in the wilderness. And so David has some friends up there, but he's really exhausted and hungry and being supported by charity. But David wants his throne back. And in chapter 18, he starts doing something to get it back. He wants victory over the rebels. He wants victory over all these traitors. He wants victory over Ahithophel. But he wants a victory which protects the life of Absalom, his chief enemy. So David issues his orders in 18 verse 1. David mustered the men who were with him and appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. David sent out his troops, a third under the command of Joab, a third under Joab's brother Abishai, son of Zeruiah, and a third under Ittai the Gittite. The king told the troops, I myself will surely march out with you. But the men said, you must not go out. If we are forced to flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us died, they won't care. But you are worth 10,000 of us. It would be better now for you to give us support from the city. That's Mahanaim. The king answered, I will do whatever seems best to you. So the king stood beside the gate while all his men marched out in units of hundreds and of thousands. The king commanded Joab, Abishai and Ittai, "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." And all the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders. So David divides up his troops into thousands and hundreds, and he appoints brigadiers and lieutenant colonels in command of them, but over them all 3 generals: Joab and Abishai, who are brothers, and Ittai, the faithful Philistine, you remember. The 3 generals persuade David not to go into battle. They say, "You stay here in Mahanaim, Barzillai will look after you. You stay there, we'll go out into battle on your behalf, because if you're killed or you're captured, the whole thing is over. There'll be nothing left to fight for. Your life is paramount, it must be saved." So another march past is held, and all the troops march past with David taking the salute. But David's last order is, protect Absalom. You see, his love for Absalom was undying, and yet his love for Absalom would be his undoing. And in verses 6 to 18, the battle took place in a forest east of the Jordan. Israel, this is the northern tribes, remember, was routed. They took 20,000 casualties. And in the course of the battle, Absalom, when fleeing, was caught by his hair in the branches of an oak tree, and he was swinging there, swinging between heaven and on earth, and unable to release himself. The source of his pride had become the cause of his death. And Absalom's predicament was reported to General Joab. Now, Joab was furious. Now, was Joab a faithful or a traitor? He was a faithful inasmuch as he was always fighting for King David, but he was a traitor in as much as he repeatedly disobeyed the orders of King David. He'd already killed Abner against David's will back in chapter 3 in a private room, stabbed him in the stomach, and David was horrified. What does Joab do now? He's horrified that this soldier who's brought him the message that Absalom is swinging there in the tree, Absalom said, "Why didn't you kill the man?" And he said, "I didn't dare. The king, I wouldn't stand a chance in the king's eyes if I'd done that." So this is what happened. Verse 11. Joab said to the man who had told him this, "What? You saw him? Why didn't you strike him to the ground right there? Then I would have had to give you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt." But the man replied, "Even if 1,000 shekels were weighed out in my hands, I wouldn't lay a hand on the king's son. In our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, protect the young man Absalom for my sake. And if I'd put my life in jeopardy, and nothing's hidden from the king, you would have kept your distance from me." Joab said, "I'm not going to wait like this for you." So he took 3 javelins in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. And 10 of Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him and killed him. Joab took the law into his own hands. He got 3 javelins and he thrust them into Absalom's heart. "Here's one for Amnon. Here's one for burning my barley field. Here's one for usurping David as king." I made that up, by the way. Joab rebukes the soldier and goes and kills Absalom himself. And then Absalom is buried in a pit in the forest, and they pile a heap of stones over him. Oh, but never mind, Absalom had built himself a monument. Look at verse 18. During his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the king's valley as a monument to himself, for he thought, "I have no son to carry on the memory of my name." He named the pillar after himself, and it's called Absalom's monument to this day. Like Saul had done, he built a monument to his own glory, you may remember. We called him Monument Man. Here's Absalom doing the same thing. He's built a monument to his own glory in the king's valley. Actually, he died ignominiously, and he'd been buried in a pauper's grave in a forest. Now the problem was, who is going to tell David that David's oldest living son and his favourite is now dead? And Ahimaaz, volunteers. Remember, he's the priest who'd taken the news to David, get across the river. And Joab says, no, not you, because you're emotionally involved. You're an Israelite. We'll send this Cushite. Now, a Cushite was a person from Sudan, a black African, not an Israelite. And Abner says, you man, you go and tell David what has happened in this battle. So the Cushite goes, he makes his way on foot to Jerusalem. Ahimaaz then asks again, and Joab gives way in the end, and he says, okay, you go. But Ahimaaz outran the Cushite, and Ahimaaz got to David first. And this is what he said. Chapter 18, verse 28. Ahimaaz called out to the king, all is well. He bowed down before the king with his face to the ground and said, praise be to the Lord your God. He has delivered up those who lifted their hands against my lord the king. The king asked, is the young man Absalom safe? Ahimaaz answered, I saw great confusion, just as Joab was about to send the king's servant to me, your servant, but I don't know what it was. In other words, Ahimaaz bottled out. He didn't dare tell the king that he knew that Absalom was dead. Then the Cushite arrived, and he told the king, but in a rather guarded way. Look at verse 32. The king asked the Cushite, is the young man Absalom safe? The Cushite replied, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man. The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, oh, my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom. If only I had died instead of you, oh, Absalom, my son, my son. David is devastated. His heart is broken. 5 times he calls up, my son, my son. He's shaken to the core. He sobs his heart out because his son, his heir apparent, is dead. Now, if the Bible is the bread of life and is meant to nourish us in our spiritual walk with God, how can we get some help from this? I've already commented on the echoes we hear from the New Testament here in the Old. Hannah in the Old, glorifying God in that wonderful poem that she wrote when she knew she was going to have her first son, Samuel. Mary, glorifying God in the Magnificat when she hears she's going to bear Jesus, the son of David. And David, like Jesus, both were the men to whom God was going to give an eternal kingdom. David was going to be a human king in Jerusalem, but his house would last forever. Jesus was going to be the divine king who was going to be installed as humanity's eternal king. And Ahithophel and Judas, both who made a catastrophic mistake, a catastrophic error. They both opposed God's king and tried to prevent God's king from being installed. And both of them died by their own hand by hanging. I think we can also see from these passages that the authority and the power of God can use good people and bad people to bring about God's will. Notice God didn't intervene at any point directly with some sort of miraculous act, but it all worked out in the way God wanted it to work out. He said in 17 verse 14, the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. David applied Hushai as a spy. Hushai's advice was sought. He gave different advice from Ahithophel's, worse advice, but it was taken. All the actors were working within the freedom of their will, but behind the scenes, God was acting in his sovereign authority in the freedom of his will to bring about through human actions what God wanted to be the outcome. Now, an example of this might be in the life of Derby City Church. Some years ago, you may remember that the leadership of the church under Pastor David Ayling was minded to sell this premises in Curzon Street and buy a factory unit elsewhere in the town and set up the congregation there in a newer building. All was going well. Everybody was acting in good faith. But at the end of the process, almost towards the very end of the process, Wetherspoons, who had agreed to buy these premises in Curzon Street, backed out. They changed their minds. And at first, we in the leadership were devastated. But of course, it led to us eventually buying the Hope Centre, and the life of the church and the ministry of the church were transformed. Everybody was acting in good faith. God was pulling the strings behind the scenes. And this is the wonder of the authority and the sovereignty of God, that God gets his way through the free actions of human beings. Something else we see here is that Absalom had built a pillar for himself, a self-glorifying monument, so his name would never be forgotten. Everybody would remember the name of Absalom. Actually, his corpse ended up in a pauper's grave in a forest covered by a heap of rocks. Oh, how the mighty fall. We all have this tendency to think too highly of ourselves. Paul said, "Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment." And Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Don't expect monuments for yourself. Just humbly and meekly serve the Lord Jesus. But then again, in these passages, we see God's eternal plan working out. God's plan then was to establish David as the undisputed king in Jerusalem. God's plan now is to establish the Lord Jesus Christ as the undisputed king over all creation. And it says in Revelation chapter 11, the seventh angel sounded his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven which said, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever." And so I close with the words of Isaac Watts. Jesus shall reign where'er the sun doth his successive journeys run. His kingdom stretch from shore to shore, till moon shall wax and wane no more. Jesus Christ will reign and will be king over all the earth, to the glory of God the Father. Amen.